I can't believe it. A bunch of silent philosophers.
It's the magic of the mute button.
Okay, let us start then, and if people filter in afterwards, I'll just admit them. So welcome to the 40th edition of the Bucharest Princeton Seminar. We've been at this a while. Tonight we will be talking about Émilie du Châtelet. The title of our panel is Émilie du Châtelet's Epistemic Foundations. And the first speaker tonight will be Clara from Paderborn University. Clara, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm just gonna share my screen. And can you see this?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So my talk is about Émilie du Châtelet's account of knowledge in light of her determination of a being, so what it means to be a being. And I'm really looking at what her determination of a being is and what it entails and what significance it has for her account of knowledge. So I'm going to start with the question, why look at du Châtelet's determination of what a being is? And then I'm going to move on to what this determination actually looks like. So for those of you who maybe haven't read so much in the text, I'll go like briefly through what she says about what a being is and the most significant passages. And then I'm briefly going to talk about the distinction between the concept of a being and of essence. And then in the conclusion, I'm going to talk about the significance of du Châtelet's determination of a being for her account of knowledge. So while scholarship on du Châtelet has been growing exponentially over the last 3 decades, and we have numerous contributions with regard to her historical classification and position, astoundingly little has been written about some key aspects of du Châtelet's account of knowledge. And that is, I mean, the account of knowledge in its own right. And we have quite a few significant and very impactful contributions deeming du Châtelet an idealist or a realist, a discussion which was very much set off at the Boston conference in 2016. That's especially Ruth Hagengruber, then also Mario Stan and Jacobs, who entered this discussion. Then we've got a lot of contributions discussing whether she's a rationalist or an empiricist, or how she fits into this rationalist empiricist tradition with regard to her proximity and distinction to other authors such as Leibniz, Wolff, and Newton. And we can name Blank here, Hecht, Sarah Hutton. And then we've got a large volume of work concerning du Châtelet as a historical figure, for example, Zünsser and Reichenberger. And these are just examples. But scholarship on du Châtelet's account of knowledge itself is really only in its very infancy. And this is largely, I believe, due to the fact that du Châtelet as a woman writer, despite being influential in the history of philosophy, was largely rediscovered as an important intellectual over the last 3 decades. And scholarship on her contemporaries, such as Descartes, Leibniz, Wolff, and Newton, had already been well established at that point. So du Châtelet's scholarship took upon the task to establish her writing within a more or less already fixed history. So the question of how to position her was very, very dominant in this beginning of scholarship on du Châtelet. And I see this panel here, along with Annaliese's conference last week and some of the recent New Voices talks, as a great opportunity to fill this desideratum and investigate some of the key aspects of Du Châtelet's account of knowledge, sort of in its own right. And so another thing I want to mention here in the beginning is that when Du Châtelet's account of knowledge itself is investigated in line with the title of her book and probably her main intention, it has often been approached from the perspective of her foundation of physics. So we've got Catherine's work in this direction and Andrew's work, of course. And what I see like Catherine Bading to say is that she sees her metaphysics largely as a method to tackle some of the most pressing questions concerning the interaction of bodies that was posed in the science of physics of her time. And Janiak, like Andrew Janiak, shows similarly that her chapters on knowledge establish an entirely new approach to the science of physics. So I kind of agree with the main thesis, and it may well be that Du Châtelet's account of knowledge was developed with exactly those physical questions and a method for physics, for the science of physics in mind. And but I also think that Du Châtelet thinks that, and this is really what I want to focus on today, that the principles of knowledge of nature can, as a theory of knowledge itself, become a subject of investigation, i.e. as principles and fundamental concepts of knowledge which pertain to nature as a whole, kind of a theory of knowledge. And when we look at Du Châtelet's writings on knowledge itself, aside from the first two principles of knowledge, Du Châtelet's determination of what a being is becomes fundamental to this theory, since all subsequent main concepts in her account of knowledge, i.e. essence, attribute, mode, and substance, build on the determination of a being. And I think her concepts of space and time are also very much related to this determination. So before I begin to outline Du Châtelet's determination of a being, let me say a few words about the significance of the theme for some of the current debates on Du Châtelet's idealism or realism. So since the investigation into the determination of a being allows us to understand how the mind and its object, i.e. a being, are interrelated in Du Châtelet's account of knowledge, I think that to analyze Du Châtelet's determination of a being is preliminary and crucial for a discussion on whether in what sense Du Châtelet can be seen as an idealist or a realist. Yet the categorization of Du Châtelet into these schools demands an extensive determination of the concept of idealism and realism on the one hand, and also an exposition of what is to be achieved by this classification, which is beyond the scope of my particular project. And I think a similar thing is the case with regard to positioning her between rationalism and empiricism. We can see in her determination of a being that the constitution of nature is based on principles, which are also principles of the mind, and would suggest she was, a rationalist. Yet the mind in Du Châtelet is not purely logical, but rather also intrinsically related to the senses and experience, which is only an example of the fact that positioning Du Châtelet between rationalism and empiricism is far more complicated than it might at first appear. And lastly, with regard to the growing scholarship which investigates Du Châtelet's account of knowledge in light of her foundation of the science of physics, the investigation of the determination of a being is especially interesting, as it shows how Du Châtelet's account of knowledge sets clear guidelines for the establishment and evaluation of judgment in the natural sciences. And judgments in the sciences and mathematics are based on the principles and concepts of how the mind understands natural beings in the first place. While I cannot go into the details of what the consequences of her determination of a being for her more physical questions, such as the interaction of bodies or the nature of gravities are, it'll become clear that her understanding of beings on the basis of rational principles paved the way towards understanding that nature can only be understood according to principles and concepts of the mind. Du Châtelet's determination of a being is based on the principles of knowledge and reveals, in conjunction with these subsequent main concepts of knowledge, exactly how the principles of knowledge function as first principles of both nature and the mind. So let me say a few words on the main premises for Du Châtelet's account of knowledge and her determination of a being. Following on from Leibniz and Wolff as her immediate predecessors, Du Châtelet placed her hopes for establishing truth in science on rational principles of knowledge, specifically two fundamental principles according to which we understand nature in the way we do. These principles are the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. And the main idea is that scientific truth and our judgments per se are not founded on observational experience, even though they become to play an important role. So I'm talking about the principal foundations here, but on principles all of the way all human beings essentially conceptualize the world and acquire knowledge. Scientific judgments are established on the basis of these principles and must adhere to them in order to be true. Reflection on these principles of knowledge in scientific judgments allows us to recognize whether a scientific judgment is true or false. The judgment is true if it can be demonstrated that the opposite assumption entails a contradiction, and it is false if it can be demonstrated that the judgment itself entails a contradiction. Du Châtelet's example is Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which is based on the principle of contradiction, since it is impossible to conceive that something, i.e. the I, is doubting while it does not exist. For judgments which pertain to contingent truths, that is, beings which can be determined in various ways, in addition to the conditio sine qua non of non-contradiction, a sufficient reason has to be given for the specific contingency the judgment refers to. For example, if I wish to explain the movements of the planets, I have to give a reason for why the planets move as they do. If no sufficient reason is given or can be given for the judgment is false. If a sufficient reason is provided and the judgment does not entail a contradiction, it is considered to be true in terms of it being most probable. Yet, as will become clear in Du Châtelet's determination of what a being is, the principles of knowledge are not merely the foundation of truth in science as a logical conception. The conception is not that scientific knowledge is applied to a world which is already present to us independently of the principles of knowledge. Rather, the principles of knowledge are principles of the natural world itself. The natural world of the beings which surround us is understood not only as the experience of existing material objects and their relationship, but as a world which is founded on certain universal principles of knowledge according to which we are able to know it. Only because nature and the way we conceive of it in the first place is based on the principles of knowledge, can the principles of knowledge in turn form the fundaments for scientific judgments on nature. Du Châtelet's conception of the natural world is based on the principles of knowledge depicted here becomes particularly clear and understandable in her determination of a being. In line with Wolff, who determines things in this manner, she bases the determination of a being on the principle of non-contradiction and thus on possibility, which is determined by the mind. She writes, and this is the key section, I quote, "One calls a being that which can exist and which determinations do not imply a contradiction, whether this being exists or whether it is only possible. For we often speak of beings past or in the future. As a consequence, give a name to everything that is possible, may it exist or not. But one calls a being of reason a chimera, which implies contradiction and can never exist, that is to say, that which is impossible." So I want to highlight, I'd like to highlight a few points here. What a being is to Du Châtelet is not dependent upon an actual existence of this being, but on the possibility of its existence according to the principle of knowledge. As is clear from du Châtelet's reference to past and future beings, her conception of being as presented here pertains to physical sensory objects which can pass in time, even if it does not exclude other kinds of beings. So I just want to say that it's important that these beings are also just physical sensory objects. And it's also clear from the fact that she later uses the example of a rock to explain how this is to be understood. A natural being is thus not merely a physically present object to du Châtelet, but a thing which is conceptually determinable and understood in its possibility according to the principle of contradiction as a principle of knowledge. In this way, the very essence of what a being is, also in the sense of a physical being, cannot be determined and understood by its actual material existence alone, but instead can only be determined and understood through relating this actuality to a world, nature, which we conceive of through fundamental principles of knowledge. Du Châtelet's determination of a physical being, or of a being in general as well, shows that nature, as well as its abstraction in mathematics and geometry, is understood not as the mere experience of existing material objects and their relationship, but as a world which is founded on certain universal principles of knowledge according to which we are able to know it, this world. A being is essentially, according to this determination, that what is possible. Contradictory determinations in an idea are possible. So a human being can have an idea with contradictory determinations, but they represent a chimera, basically a non-being. And du Châtelet differentiates in this context between possibility and actuality, where the determination of what a being is rests on possibility alone, i.e. it need not be actual to be a being. I quote, "A triangle, for example, can be drawn because it is not at all contradictory that three lines may be joined at their ends and enclose a space. Thus, whether or not in fact we draw a triangle, the triangle remains equally possible. The drawing executes that which was already possible, but it adds nothing new. This brings to light the need to distinguish between actual and possible. All that is possible is not actual, although all that is actual is possible. Thus, there must be an external cause for actuality, that is to say, for existence, which is the complement of possibility. Without actuality, a being would remain eternally in the land of possibilia, if I may express myself in this way, and would never come into existence." So a being can also just be in this realm of possibilia. The actuality of a being is expressed in attributes and modes. Actuality of a being is based on the principle of sufficient reason. And there are basically two main concepts we need to look at here. And this is attributes. They have their sufficient reason in the essential determinations. So for example, the hard matter of a rock can be gray or black, and the attributes of gray or black have their sufficient reason in this matter. And modes have their sufficient reason in antecedent modes or different beings. So beings are constituted according to the principle of contradiction, but they are also known on the basis of that same principle. Since a being so du Châtelet writes, "Since a being becomes possible by its essence, when one wants to know the possibility of a being, one must know its essence. That is to say that the way in which the being can come about. Thus, the essence is the first thing that one is able to conceive in a being, and no being could subsist without essence." She says beings are known through the non-contradiction or possibility of their primordial or essential determinations. Du Châtelet emphasizes in this context that a further intrinsic reason for why the essential determinations are found in a being cannot be given. Her course of argumentation is that since these are the first determinations that can be said of a being, we cannot conceive of some prior intrinsic reason for why these determinations are what they are. Her claim seems to be obvious. We recognize and understand beings according to their primordial determinations and their non-contradiction, i.e. the hardness, etc. in the case of the rock, the equal distance of all points of a line to a center point in the case of a circle. And these beings are nothing to us before or beyond the recognition of these determinations. For example, we must recognize the non-contradiction of all points of a line being the same distance from a middle point in order to grasp the being of a circle. And the being of a circle is nothing before or beyond these non-contradictory determinations. Expressed differently, beings and our knowledge of beings are mutually conditioning concepts to Du Châtelet. So as I want to look briefly at being versus essence as these two concepts. As we've seen above, the determination of a being and of essence are both based on the principle of contradiction in Du Châtelet. In other words, the non-contradiction of any given set of primordial determinations, i.e. their possibility to exist together, is what determines both the concept of a being and the concept of essence. We can thus say that in one sense, a being and essence amount to identical determinations in Du Châtelet. Hence, the question is posed, in what way are they different concepts at all? So in what way are being and essence different concepts? And the difference between the concept of a being and of essence comes down to the fact that a being can become actual, while the essence of a being signifies its primordial determinations in their possibility alone. Let me explain in more detail in what sense the concept of essence and of being amounts to the same content and in what way the concepts are nevertheless distinct. As we have seen, Du Châtelet writes in her determination of a being that we often speak of past or future beings, i.e. beings which do not have actuality in this very instance. She explains that these possible beings are still beings despite their lacking actuality, as opposed to a contradictory idea, which is a chimera. A circle is a being and possible even if it has never been drawn, but a circle with a corner is impossible, since the determination of all points being the same distance from a middle point and the determination of two lines crossing forming an edge is one and the same figure is contradictory. The same is the case for the essence. Essential determinations can either exist together and are possible because they do not contradict each other, or they do contradict each other and are thus impossible and a chimera. If a being is only possible but not actual, like a Tyrannosaurus rex, there's thus no difference in content between the being and its essence. Yet Du Châtelet goes on to explain that all possible beings can become actual through a sufficient reason. There needs to be a sufficient reason for the actuality of the being, such as me being on Earth because I was born by my parents. This is not the case for a being's essential determinations. Hence, in addition to the essence of a being, its possible determinations, a being can always become actual. In its actuality, the concepts of attribute and of mode are an integral part of the concept of being. Hence, the concept of essence only pertains to the constant determinations making a being possible, while the concept of a being in addition to the essence expresses that this possibility is either actual or not actual. So let me summarize the significance of Du Châtelet's determination of a being for her account of knowledge. The principles of knowledge are the foundations of beings. This includes a physical being like a rock, a geometric abstract being like a triangle, or a concept like matter, in their possibility through the principle of non-contradiction and in their actuality through the principle of sufficient reason. And Du Châtelet maintains, like Leibniz involved before her, that the principles of knowledge are metaphysical principles and that they lead to metaphysical truths. In Du Châtelet, this amounts to an account of knowledge wherein the principles of knowledge form the foundation of the mind and the foundation of what beings are simultaneously. And this last point is important, that these principles are not only principles of knowledge as in principles of the mind, but they are principles of what beings are. So what this nature that we can perceive is in the first place and constituted of in the first place. The natural world we know and the abstraction therefrom in mathematics and geometry is thus intrinsically mentally determined in terms of it not being contradictory and in terms of every actual existence having a sufficient reason for its existence. Thank you.
Yay. Thank you, Clara, for a great talk. So we will take questions after all three talks. Please announce your question in the chat before. And now we will move on to the next speaker, who is Annelies Ray from Paris-Nanterre. Annelies?
Yes, thank you, Claudia. I will share my screen. I will try to do it.
Does it
Work
work?
for you? Oh,
No, you should
No?
have the, you should be able to.
yes.
That works, but it's not centered yet.
It's okay or not at all? Just perhaps like that. It's better.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot for your kind invitation. I will try to develop a line of discussion concerning du Châtelet's epistemic situation, power, and limits of knowledge. My intervention aims to question the epistemic status of the knowing subject in Institution de Physique. And it is a question of asking whether our necessary imperfection, I quote the paragraph 28, where du Châtelet talk about our necessary imperfection. So that is my point that I will try to elucidate. What does it mean? This and how, I repeat it again, necessary imperfection stems from a form of epistemic impotence specific to our human condition with a limited understanding, or if this limitation, this imperfection, is not, on the contrary, the starting point of a redefinition of our power to know. This epistemology of positioning, if you understand what I have in mind by referring to this expression, is a means of identifying the anthropological issues of the construction of certainty in physics. To the old antiphon of the hypothesis non fingo, supposedly embodied in a Newtonian methodological slogan, the generality of which is often overdetermined, but which would guarantee a certain knowledge of nature, I would now like to oppose an hypothesis fingo, a I imagine hypothesis, which du Châtelet used to think about certainty. And the question is formulated in these terms. Is recourse to hypothesis the condition for obtaining certain knowledge in physics, or is it, on the contrary, what leads us back to a form of uncertainty constituting our epistemic imperfection? Now, the imagination of hypothesis is the answer to our epistemic helplessness and impatience. And it is our path to certainty. It is this question of epistemic limitation that I would like to work on here. In the foreword, yes, in the foreword.
Annelies,
Yes.
your screen is a bit too small for the text.
Ah,
We,
okay.
we can't feel a bit.
There it's better.
Slightly more. Yeah, now that's perfect.
Now it's okay? Okay. So in the foreword, after having recalled that the truth can take different forms, she indicates that we still have only partial and confused representation in physics. It's the point 7. I'll quote it. We are still in physics like that man blind from birth to whom Cheselden returned his sight. This man at first saw nothing but confusedly. It was only by groping and after a considerable time that he began to see clearly. This time has not quite come for you yet, and perhaps it will never come entirely. That there are probably some truths which are not meant to be seen by the eyes of our mind, just as there are objects that those of our body will never perceive, but whoever refuse to learn from this consideration would look like a lame man with a fever who would not want to take the remedies which can cure him because these remedies could not prevent him from limping. It thus clearly indicates that if we do not have access to some truths, this should not prevent us from knowing. Our limitation should not lead to a renunciation, on the contrary. And this supposes to specify on which argument rests the idea that our perception of the sensible world is confused. It's my second quotation. It's okay? Yeah. Our ideas, in fact, our ideas are always an articulation of obscure representation and clear ideas. And that is the point. Paragraph 132, that an infinity of obscure representation accompany our clearest ideas. It is what we cannot deny if we do a little attention, if we pay a little attention to ourselves. Because we do not have a perceptual apparatus sharp enough to construct the distinction required in the face of the multiplicity and the relative weakness of certain representation. But if this argument seems to be based on the fairly classic thesis of our epistemic impotence, itself founded on the observation of our constitutive imperfection, I recall in this regard, I quote in this regard a passage from the paragraph 134. I quote, as it is impossible for us to represent the internal state of all simple beings, on which, however, the phenomenon of extension depends, we don't have access to all perception of realities by our nature. End of quotation. The interest here is to underline that this confusion and this obscurity are necessary to guarantee the possibility of each of our points of view on the world. That is to say, in short, the possibility of being human or of being able to perceive the phenomena. And I quote the paragraph 143. There is a fault. It's not 44. It's not 54. It's 53. This degree of confusion and imperfection of our organs is necessary for us to see objects as we perceive them. A being more perfect than us would have any other ideas or would see things quite differently from us, and for that he could see the same objects as us and receive the same impression. It would have to deprive himself of the faculty of perceiving distinctly, because the distinction of the parts and the phenomena which result from their confusion and which arise from it together are incompatible. This is why a statue which is made to be placed on a high elevation appears to us hideous and crude when we see it up close and out of the point of view for which it is intended. because we have a distinct idea of all the features from which the wall that make the face must result, and this because these features are too large to be confused beyond a certain distance, to the point where they must be so to make a pleasant image. Thus, a being whose eyes are natural prism would have no more idea of white than a deaf person at the idea of a sound. The point is important for me because it designates an epistemic position or situation, if you prefer, which conceived the perception of phenomena, including the confusion that it inevitably leads to, less as a failure than as the affirmation of an epistemic identity. To put it even more clearly, how to preserve the relevance and the legitimacy of the search for truth if we suppose that the perception of phenomena is always lacking in relation to the intellectual understanding of ideas. This is the whole issue of the analysis of the function of the imagination of hypothesis. And we will therefore see that in order to know nature, we must have a partial point of view. From the desolation with regard to our constitutive limitation to the delimitation of what I can know, a conception of knowledge is gradually being developed, which makes its precariousness, I hope I am clear, its precariousness a consubstantial dimension. Knowing is to be precare. I see here a gesture which links epistemology and anthropology. That is, which indexes my power to know to my definition of what is a human. In short, which assumes already the importance of the epistemic situation. But if the epistemology of positioning, as it was, for example, presented by Sandra Harding, leads us to pay attention to socially constructed conception of gender, gender norms, gender interests, or even gendered experiences on the production of knowledge. I have in mind the paper from, for example, from Elizabeth Anderson, Feminist Epistemology and Interpretation and the Defense. It very often leads to questioning the objectivity value of socially situated knowledge, as if situating knowledge amounts to undermining its objectivity. However, we are not here in the same situation, in the same case. It seemed to me that Émilie du Châtelet proposes an articulation of two meanings of positioning, which makes her an essential 18th century philosopher. On the one hand, what I call an opacifying veil, namely the difficulty in grasping the philosophical originality or consistency of du Châtelet's thought on nature, is also due to another prejudice or the less to a certain number of presuppositions on what would be the epistemology of the Enlightenment. These assumptions will still largely consensual in the historiography of the Enlightenment, make the Newtonian moment the tipping point of modern science, thereby opposing any conception of science based on metaphysical principle. Classically, it is a question here of opposing Descartes and his epigons to Newtonian modernity, and thus discussing the criteria making it possible to characterize what is meant by modern science. But in this division of the scholarly world, a position like Émilie du Châtelet's one is invisible, making Leibniz, Wolff, and Newton coexist, or even thinking without exception of the articulation between experimental philosophy and a reconfigured metaphysics, do not seem to have any place in this relatively shared historiographical construction. Even so, du Châtelet turns out not to be the only one to question the relevance of this categorization. If she is invisible, she is not for all that isolated. That's the first reason, it seems to me. On the other hand, and perhaps more fundamentally, she chooses to characterize the knowledge situated as a humanized knowledge. That is, this knowledge is thought finally at the level of a human being and not, as always, at fault, in default, if I can say. On this condition, she proposed to assume our epistemic identity. However, this supposes developing a threefold strategy. First, by identifying the principle in the first chapter of the institution with the axiom, and by blurring the irreducibility of the oppositions between the two types of truths, necessary and contingent. I saw that Arwains is here, and it's exactly her subject. She leads us to question the transformation of the meaning of metaphysics in this text, and this is decisive for elucidate the meaning of the well-known formula addressed to Frederick of Prussia, and physics cannot do without the metaphysics on which it is founded. When she writes at the end of the foreword that she wishes to bring metaphysics closer to your side, because she talks to imaginary to her son, she fits into an interpretative line that proposes to transform the meaning of metaphysics. 15 years later, in 1755, by writing the article Element of Science, Element de Science, D'Alembert proposed for his part to distinguish alongside the metaphysics understood as a science of purely spiritual beings, and on the other, a specific metaphysics to each science, defined as the general consequences that result from our observation. But here, in the Institution de Physique, we are witnessing the reconfiguration of the role, normative and regulatory, and therefore of the meaning of metaphysics. And this has consequences for the delimitation of a perimeter for the construction of certain knowledge in the phenomenal field. The delimitation of phenomenal field within which we can know with certainty, it's in the paragraph 134, I quote it again. By our nature, we don't have access to any perception of reality, and we are left with the confused ideas we have of each of the simple beings, only an idea of several things coexisting and linked together without our knowing distinctly how they are linked. And it is this confused idea that gives birth to the phenomenon of extension. Now, it is this phenomenal field which constitutes the territory of certain knowledge by our epistemic point of view. Since in the paragraph 136, she adds about monads, but whether we admit them or refute them, our research on the nature of things will not be less certain, because in our experiences, we will never reach these first elements that compound the body. And she will apply this perimeter of certain knowledge later in the text when she deals with the question of attraction, as it is well known. Thus, in this very last paragraph of the chapter 8, she writes that to find the reason for the effects, it is not always necessary to go back to the first reason of things. So it may be enough to use one phenomenon to explain another. And at a first level, we could interpret this chapter 8 as the resumption of the device that we can read in the paragraph 22 of the Discourse of Metaphysics. There is a mechanical explanation of the phenomena, which we must explain by going back to the final causes. But Du Châtelet's essential gesture is to inscribe Newton's central hypothesis, attraction, within the framework of this mechanical explanation, in such a way that by doing this, Du Châtelet constructs a device, un dispositif, I don't know if it's clear in English, a device, in which there is on the one hand a primary reason for all the phenomena, which is explained by the confused presence of substantiality in the phenomena, and on the other hand, there is a possible mechanical explanation of the phenomena, and centrally of the phenomenon of attraction, which does not suppose to go back to a primary reason, but which is nonetheless conceivable distinctly and intelligible, explicable. It is the quotation of the paragraph 164. I don't read, but you have it just in the PowerPoint. But inside this territory, which is sufficient in itself, Du Châtelet must finally forge the means to develop a certain knowledge, which is, to take again the paragraph 57, not far from the demonstration. And it is the return to the hypothesis that makes this possible. The hypothesis understood as a supposition which accounts for a phenomenon by relating our conception of the hypothesis to the determination of the certainty that it implies. And it's the paragraph 67. I don't read it because I am late. By indicating the path which leads the hypothesis from supposition to truth, Du Châtelet justifies the use of hypothesis in physics by our ignorance of the causes of movement in nature. It is legitimate on the condition that its use is regulated, evaluated, and in some way validated by the principle of sufficient reason. Under certain conditions, this hypothesis is almost equivalent to a proof. And in this paragraph 57, she develops a reflection on certainty, probability.
Oh no, did we lose Annalise? Oh, that's no good. What I propose to do until she comes back is that we maybe take a couple of questions for Clara. And so if Annalise comes back, she can continue, and if not, we'll just have Aaron and hope that she can make it back by the end of the session. What say you? Sounds good. So if you have questions for Clara, please either raise your hand or write a line in the chat. Oh, Andrew?
Thank you. I really appreciated your talk. I have a quick question. I hope it's fair. I guess my question is how you see this analysis of the principles of knowledge and of beings and their essences, as it were, connected to the other chapters in the Institution, because it is, of course, striking that you're starting out with these classic topics, as you pointed out, but then you get to, attraction, the inclined plane, and free fall, and astronomical discussions. So maybe it's too big a question to answer, but if you have any thoughts of how the two aspects of the Institution are connected, that would be interesting.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. So I think I mean, there are, I think, two ways to answer this question. I think you can go sort of from a historical point of view, and then I think you can say that du Châtelet started out with some more, say, physical questions, or questions which we today consider as being in the history of physics, such as interaction of bodies and gravity and the force-weave debate and all this. And then I think she reached a point where there were certain questions that needed some form of foundation in terms of how do we actually, what is the criterion for us to judge that whether, for example, matter is thinking, or, like her whole argument against Locke's thinking matter. So why do I believe this is not founded? And to do this, she had to go onto a more principled question, i.e., what is the foundation on which I can argue? And the foundation for looking for the foundations, she obviously has strong roots in Leibniz and Wolff, but I think for her it's really the question, how is the conception of nature founded, and also the conception of nature as in mathematics and physics. And then I think you can go another way, like differently from this historical perspective, and you can just look at the content. And if you look at the content, I think this part that I'm looking at of her metaphysics, i.e. not this claim that also Leibniz and Wolff have, that you can draw certain conclusions about God on the basis of these principles, or on freedom, or things like that, like concepts which Kant said are sort of metaphysical ideas which you can't answer on this basis. If you look at her foundation of how do we conceive of nature, it's very much related to the later debates, because she needs the whole explanation of how do we acquire and how can we judge scientific knowledge. And to do this, she says, we must look into how we conceive of nature, of the world in the first place. And she brings this down to these principles. And I think there are many, many aspects where she'll later need this. So for example, in her chapter on time, she has this whole exposition of what in this idea of time belongs to an imaginary being, and what we can do with it in metaphysics and in physics, and how it is related to existence of beings, and why we can't have an idea of time without having abstracted it from this existence of beings. And there's really like no way to explain this without this say metaphysical exposition, if you want to call it this. And then also I think the question of how scientific judgments can be judged to be true or false is very much based on the whole exposition, because she's got these clear guidelines. If it entails a contradiction, it's wrong. If it doesn't, if I can actually demonstrate it doesn't entail a contradiction, it's correct. And then we've got this whole realm of probability, but this is also due to, this also has absolute guidelines. So if I establish a scientific judgment as opposed to the actuality of something, which is the case in physics, then I need to give a sufficient reason. And if my observations, for example, provide reasons for a different kind of theory, then I have a problem, right? I have to somehow explain how my theory fits with what I observe. And I can't just go over this principle of sufficient reason. So the content of what the sufficient reason is up for debate and is part of more or less certainty of probability. But that I adhere to giving a sufficient reason and dealing with things that seem to contradict a reason, that is a part of a scientific absolute strategy, right? So I can't just say, oh, I don't have a sufficient reason, but it's not a problem. That's unscientific, right? So I think it's very much the basis for saying this is the way we can argue in the science of physics, and this is the way we can't argue. And then also, if we look at the third chapter, all the
Annalise, back.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, just one last word about this is just like the other concept, just such as substance and obviously essence, attribute, and mode. They also are very much based on this, and they of course then play a major role in explaining gravity and force weave and so on. But you'll know better than me.
All right. Thank you so much both for stepping in the breach and covering the few minutes in which we had lost Annalise. Annalise, if you want to give the rest of your presentation now. We were on the hypothesis slide.
Yes, I just want to conclude, and perhaps without PowerPoint, just few words. I don't know exactly when you lose me or when I lose you, I don't know. But yes, my point was this one. Émilie du Châtelet asks this crucial question: can we achieve certainty when we are imperfect in an imprecise world? And she replies, yes, on condition of constructing a method that makes the hypothesis a path to certainty. And my conclusion is a quotation of the paragraph 176. It is a waste of our time to try to guess these imperceptible mysteries, and we must confine ourselves to carefully observing the qualities which come to our senses and the phenomena which result from them, and which we can make use of to explain why other phenomena which depend on them. End of quotation. What we can do is to build devices that are at the level of men or women, and that assume our epistemic ambition, that is the title of the panel, to know by our own means and to build in the earth of uncertainty a path towards certainty, which articulates metaphysics and experience, hypothesis and observation. On this condition, by this way, imagining hypothesis is a means of producing certainty in knowledge. And it seems to me that is undoubtedly the epistemic inventiveness of Émilie du Châtelet. That is the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Annalise. All right, so our next speaker will be Aaron Wells from Paderborn. He also has some internet issues, so I think he will keep his camera off for the talk, but he has a PowerPoint.
Yes, thanks to the organizers. I've been having these issues, so it seems to be better now, but just in case, I'm going to keep my camera off and just share my screen. That's visible, I assume. All right, so as the title suggests, I'm going to argue that Émilie du Châtelet breaks with Christian Wolff regarding the scope and epistemological content of the principle of sufficient reason, despite his influence on her basic ontology and their agreement that the principle of sufficient reason has foundational importance. So let's start with some background. Principles of sufficient reason have gotten a lot of attention in philosophy generally lately, and I'm not trying to defend any conclusive general definition of them here. In fact, I agree with Yitzhak Melamed and Martin Lin in their Stanford Encyclopedia article that the principle of sufficient reason is more like in practice a family of principles, and one can intelligibly disagree about what the principle should amount to. Kant's 1790 polemic against Eberhard's Wolffian account of the principle is a well-known example of this. As a first pass, we can consider the slogan that everything in a certain domain has a reason or ground. Most, if not all, principles of sufficient reason are variants of this. And of course, to be actually helpful, the slogan will need to be made more precise, but it brings out how a philosopher, such as an early modern rationalist philosopher, might have different options regarding exactly what the principle of sufficient reason says. How wide is its domain? Is it everything in general or more restricted? And what does it mean to have a reason? And what are the epistemological implications of that? So in turn, a principle of sufficient reason looms large in du Châtelet's Institution de Physique. This principle plays a systematically important role in her account of understanding and ultimately of science, as well as supporting a number of more specific positions she advances. And Christian Wolff also makes much of a principle of sufficient reason, and Wolff is widely agreed to be an important influence on the Institution. This is especially clear in the chapter on ontology, covering notions like substance, essence, attribute, and mode, which Clara was just discussing. The principle of sufficient reason is an ontological principle for Wolff in that it holds of all possible entities, with the possible exception of God. So one might infer that du Châtelet's PSR, or principle of sufficient reason, is similar or even identical in content to Wolff's. And some have in fact drawn this conclusion in the literature. One reason to doubt this is that the PSR seems to have a much more limited role in science for du Châtelet, and therefore her conception of science differs from his. I'll talk about this point later, but it's too big a topic to cover in detail, and there's a fair bit of controversy and discussion of science in du Châtelet in the literature already. So in this talk, I mainly want to get clear on how these two philosophers think of the scope of the principle of sufficient reason and also its relationship to understanding via the notion of a reason. So let's begin with questions of scope. There are actually many possible questions here. Remember that I said that principles of sufficient reason in general state that everything in a certain domain has a reason or ground. One way to narrow the domain is to specify the kind of entity involved. It could be just properties or objects or propositions, facts, or even more regimented types of properties and objects and so forth. Another way to narrow the domain is to introduce a modal stipulation. Perhaps the PSR just applies to what's contingent. And these questions link up with the modal status of the PSR itself in interesting ways. For example, some have read Leibniz as saying that a restricted scope PSR is necessary, but an unrestricted scope PSR is contingent. But these are topics I won't get into here. Neither will I discuss in detail how du Châtelet's PSR has what might be called a limited subjective scope. That is, it applies to beings with cognitive faculties like ours. I don't talk about this now because it's something that Wolff might actually agree with her about, not so much with someone like Descartes or Leibniz, because Wolff goes so far as to link both the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of non-contradiction to the specific nature of human beings. Anyway, I'm going to focus on what might be called the objective scope of the principle of sufficient reason, meaning what its objects are. So starting with Wolff then, the principle has a wide scope, everything that is, as he puts it. This is not restricted to what is actual. The PSR is a distinctively philosophical principle for Wolff, and philosophy is the science of the possible. So the PSR ranges over the possible. Now this actually requires some further explanation, what the possible is. The possible in the context of early modern rationalism often calls to mind possible individual entities. For example, Julius Caesar is a possible as well as an actual entity. We can then ask which collections of such entities can make up possible worlds. This is the Leibnizian question of compossibility, which is certainly a question Wolff is interested in. But when Wolff is talking about the possible, he's usually referring to something that he considers in a way prior in explanation to individual possible entities. What he has in mind are simple positive properties and their relations of compatibility or incompatibility. It is these properties and relations that explain which individual entities are possible at all. And these properties and relations, he thinks, are accessible to our cognitive faculties and provide reasons or grounds for the very possibility of individual entities like Julius Caesar. The same point holds for natural kinds. Wolff is a nominalist. So these are built up out of first the simple positive properties and relations, and then the essences that those combine into, and so on from there. So it's a complicated picture, but the basic idea is that Wolff's PSR has a very wide scope. It ranges over the properties of all possible finite objects, leaving aside God. It seems like he's an exception. And it drills down to how these possible properties combine or don't combine into essences of possible things. And crucially, the way that such properties are and how they relate is itself necessary, as are the essences that result from this, which means that Wolff's PSR ranges over necessary, timeless relations between essences and their more fundamental metaphysical conditions. In turn, the more ordinary and familiar natural necessity in the actual world depends for Wolff on facts about essences. The paradigmatic case, again, is that of the real definition, which Wolff takes to express essence. And the PSR can also allow us to move from necessary truths about possible essences to necessary truths about what actually is going on in the natural world. And at this stage, we can turn to Châtelet, who I think describes the scope of the PSR a bit differently. So the basic import of her principle of sufficient reason is that any contingent truth has a sufficient reason by which an intelligent being could understand why it's true. She refers to truths or reasons that are the objects of understanding for an intelligent being here. And I propose, and I've done some defense of this elsewhere, that we take this somewhat literally, such that truths or propositions are the immediate subject matter of her principle of sufficient reason. Now, propositions do represent the world as being a certain way. At least they ought to. So in immediate sense, it does look like true propositions will have implications about how the world is. There'll be some kind of correspondence. So this means her principle is not just a semantic or linguistic principle. That raises questions about what sense, about the sense in which and to what extent propositions need to be true in order to enable understanding for Châtelet, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Because first I want to say more about this important modal restriction on the principle's scope. So it applies, she says, to all contingent truths. And there are many necessary truths it doesn't apply to. It doesn't apply to truths of logic or of mathematics, and also, importantly for our purposes, to whatever truths there are about primitive essential properties of possible things. Now, does it apply to any necessary truths? Maybe. There are some truths about God it applies to. I don't actually think so, but it doesn't really matter for the current discussion, so I'll leave it aside. In any case, this is already a major difference in scope from Wolff's PSR, because he very clearly included necessities in the scope of the principle, and it's independent from the question of whether the PSR applies to propositions or to things and properties. So this is just to summarize that there are these two distinctions I've just laid out in terms of scope that are not really, they're logically separable from one another. One is about the kinds of objects that the PSR ranges over, and the other is about, it's just sort of a modal claim that could hold for objects or for facts, propositions, whatever you want. The point is that Châtelet excludes the necessary from the domain of the proposition of the principle of sufficient reason, and Wolff definitely does not exclude it. So that brings us to the second topic, a bigger topic. So this will be very sketchy, the principle of sufficient reason and understanding. So unsurprisingly, for both of these philosophers, the principle of sufficient reason has an epistemic dimension. It's linked to understanding or comprehension. They use various terms for this, at least Wolff does, because we've got three different languages going on. A helpful contrast here would be a purely metaphysical principle of sufficient reason, which is maybe known from the contemporary metaphysics literature, that would state that there are no brute or metaphysically ungrounded facts, and say a little more about, say, what we can understand or what's understandable. Even so, it's hard to tell exactly what Châtelet and Wolff mean by this reference to understanding at first glance. There's a lot that could be going on here, especially because there's this well-known related problem in this time period of what a reason is, or a Grund or raison or whatever, ratio and so on. Is it metaphysical? Is it epistemic, semantic? Is it all of these things somehow? There are many answers to this that are possible during the period. So I'm going to try to say a bit about what Wolff might think. And this is maybe a bit controversial. A lot of people have other readings, but I read him as regarding reasons as in the first instance, the metaphysical. And there is straightforward textual evidence for this. This is often obscured by the fact that Wolff does distinguish reasons and causes. For example, he denies that his PSR is just the same as a nihil esse sine causa principle. But actually, I think the reason-cause distinction is a distinction within metaphysics, understood as whatever deals with real substances or race. Causes for Wolff are substances, in the first instance, things like God, finite souls, and non-mind-like simple substances. Derivatively, composite material beings can be described as if they are substances and exercise causal powers, even if this isn't strictly correct. Really, their essences are mereological and not so fundamental. Anyway, substances, whether fundamental or not, are supposed to, they can at least be treated as if they are causally active via causal powers or forces. And Wolff says clearly that their causal activities just are reasons or grounds. We could also translate Gründe that way. And this is why Wolff defines reason as contained in a thing, not contained in a mind or something like that. Consider Wolff's example, quoted here. Plants grow quickly, for example, in a greenhouse, but why? The answer he gives here is metaphysical, straightforwardly. The air in the greenhouse is warm. But saying that is a bit rough, because actually Wolff wants to distinguish that that statement is both a statement of a cause and a statement of a reason. So here the cause would be the subject, as it were, that causes the change, namely a sort of substantial thing, the air, really, he would call it a phenomenal substance, which is the bearer of the property of warmth. But then the reason is something different, but still very metaphysical, the warmth of the air, or better yet, the action of that warmth, as he puts it. So this is a very subtle distinction, and many questions could arise here, but no matter how you interpret it, it seems like the reason Wolff is talking about has to have some pretty mind-independent causal oomph, and that it only immediately serves as a reason for knowledge, inference, and so forth. And incidentally, in the top left corner, you can see that this chapter of the German metaphysics, where Wolff introduces the PSR, is explicitly concerned with the first reasons or grounds, not just of our cognition, our erkenntnis, but of all things in general. And what grounds all things in general will, in some way, intermediately determine the content of our true cognitions. But in the first instance, reasons are sort of metaphysical. And a contemporary comparison point might be the so-called ontic conception of explanation, where an explanation is a feature of the world, such as a causal process. However, for Wolff, the point generalizes beyond efficient causation, as we've seen, for example, to the metaphysical grounding relations, somewhat mysterious ones, between the possible properties and essences. In sum, insofar as Wolff connects the PSR to understanding, what he means is truly understanding metaphysical features of the world as those are the reasons he has in mind. So coming back to Châtelet again, reasons are in the first instance for her propositions, at least on my reading. So a reason will not be a causal power or something inhering in a physical substance. It will be a proposition about the warmth of the air rather than the air's warmth per se. It is in this sense that she says the PSR is a direct source of our reasonings. As linking propositions into inferences and so forth, it is not the source of, for example, the growth of plants. So here there is a complication, I think. Remember that I've said that the PSR for du Châtelet ranges over propositions, but she also talks about these propositions as being truths. And if the correspondence between truths and whatever makes them true is sufficiently exact, then it may not matter so much whether one's principal sufficient reason ranges over propositions rather than over, say, causal powers or facts or whatever. This seems like a potential objection to my claim that there is a substantive difference between Châtelet and Wolff here, rather than a more superficial difference, I guess. So to illustrate, consider what might be suggested by a passage in Leibniz. In his new essays, he writes that, quote, a cause in the realm of things corresponds to a reason in the realm of truths, unquote. So reasons, Leibniz is treating them as propositions or truths in this passage. But then if correspondence is sort of representational and not just a one-to-one mapping like in the illustration, then to grasp a reason will be to grasp a cause, perhaps. And actually, Leibniz may only have final causes in mind here and may not really have something self-representational in mind. But this sort of suggests a possibility that if there's a very close correspondence or direct enough representation, then it won't matter so much what direct objects the PSR has for one's account of understanding, because either way, there'll be close correspondence. But I don't think this objection or possible objection works for du Châtelet in particular. Maybe it does for some readings of Leibniz, because she puts the stress on the PSR's connection to understanding and not just to truth as simple correspondence. In fact, I want to suggest that the proposition's truth for her is neither necessary nor sufficient for us to understand in the way invoked by her PSR. On the one hand, it's not so controversial that many truths don't further understanding, since, for example, many truths are trivial, redundant, and so on. And she talks about this issue in the context of circular causal hypotheses, which I don't have time to get into here. The more controversial case is whether it's a necessary condition. And I think there are clearly a number of cases where, for du Châtelet, propositions that are not exactly true do further understanding why and how things are the case, and they even can provide a reason, in her words, in some sense. The best known example, which we've just been hearing about, may be du Châtelet's account of hypotheses, which I won't get into here, but also worth noting are her account of mathematical idealization, where mathematical objects are described as fictions, and even maybe her account of practical reasons, which she interestingly thinks also fall under the scope of the PSR in some way. As Marcy Lascano and others have discussed, du Châtelet thinks that we are persistently under the spell of practical illusions. So we have many false beliefs about the reasons for our actions and the actions of others, but it seems that these false beliefs can still further practical understanding to some extent, on her view. So to move towards the concluding broader implications of the paper, while du Châtelet's PSR is in some ways quite ambitious, all contingent truths are at least possibly understandable, even for beings like us. This is compatible with limitations in practice on our understanding, and with a certain relativity to some features of our cognitive capacities. A perfect intellect, for example, does not need or would not need to seek answers to why questions about nature in the way that we do. Nor would such an intellect need to use abstract mathematical objects, which are fictions that are not realized in reality, but are nevertheless epistemically indispensable for beings like us. There may even be some development on this score from du Châtelet's manuscript, which connects the PSR to complete understanding and fails to relativize this to us, that is, minds like ours. Those are changed in the final version, so maybe the manuscript that's earlier is more ambitious and closer to Wolff than the published Institution. Of course, that's speculative, but it's an interesting possibility. This brings us to a final topic, which I can only discuss very roughly here, which is that of the implications the PSR has or doesn't have for rational science. Science, according to du Châtelet, comes from reason. According to Wolff, he, broadly speaking, upholds the traditional conception of deductive scientia and regards metaphysics as having a kind of priority over both mathematics and empirical science. So while in practice empirical science has an indispensable role in discovery, it tends to be dispensable from the perspective of justification. For example, in his German Metaphysics and Cosmologia Generalis, Wolff provides a derivation of the laws of mechanics from the metaphysics of simple substances. The PSR plays an essential role in this and other similar derivations. Indeed, science comes from reason, and mere experience contains no reason at all. It does not provide the rational connections demanded by the PSR. This is true for sophisticated scientific experiments and not just for everyday perception. And now to dig a bit deeper for Wolff still, the PSR mediates the deductive inferences that make up his scientific system. So the PSR helps determine the form of the system. But there is also a link between the PSR and the content or matter of Wolffian science. For Wolff's broadly Aristotelian syllogistic inferences are about natural kind predicates, which truly represent real essences. In turn, the PSR plays a central role in Wolff's doctrine of essence. I've said a bit about this before, but briefly, there are three reasons for this. The first is that it's the key premise in Wolff's proof that things have essences in the first place. And second, Wolff tells us that to understand an essence is just to understand the way it's possible. In turn, we do this in turn by understanding those primitive positive properties and compatibility relations that make up the essence. And we do this through the PSR and also the principle of non-contradiction. And third, the reasons mentioned in the PSR for Wolff include those grounding relations between essential properties of things and their attributes and modes, a relationship that Clara was talking about earlier. So though this has been, again, a very brief, sketchy summary, there are at least 4 ways, 1 formal and 3 material, in which the PSR plays a crucial role in Wolffian science or scientia. There's a lot of literature on this that we could get into, but that's just a brief overview. So returning to du Châtelet, setting aside the PSR, I think, look, aside from what I've said in this paper, I think there's wide agreement that in some ways her account of science just doesn't look like Wolff's at first glance. There are just these evident differences. She doesn't think that absolute certainty is really possible. She doesn't think that explanation is strictly deductive, at least not all the time. And she doesn't really think that fundamental real essences need to be known for us to do science. We can't, for example, derive the laws of mechanics from the essence of fundamental substances, as Wolff has claimed to do. And it could be argued, though I'm not going to do so here, that du Châtelet is thereby better equipped than Wolff to account for the success of non-deductive reasoning and the stability and value of less than certain scientific theories. What's more tricky, though, is determining which of these differences that seem relatively obvious stem from her conception of the PSR, as opposed to other commitments, such as her specific version of metaphysical idealism, or her sympathies to a more empiricist methodology, if she has them. And I won't try to settle all of that here. What I do want to do is suggest that if, for Wolff, the PSR was a partial or a major even motivation for an ambitious deductive conception of science, then the principle of sufficient reason as du Châtelet conceives it does not provide the same kind of motivation. Why not? Well, in brief, firstly, if science is not a deductive system, as she thinks, it won't clearly derive its form from being linked up by the principle of sufficient reason. And second, if science does not characterize fundamental real essences directly, then the principle can't play the role that Wolff says it does in the content of science, or the roles, the 3 roles I talked about earlier. But there is a final point, little caveat worth addressing, which is why, if all this is true, du Châtelet regards metaphysics in a relatively positive light. And she describes it as a science. In fact, you can see this on the left in the preface to the Institution, seen there in a fair copy. And this indicates that she is sympathetic to Wolff's views to some degree. And I think I can let that into my account within certain limits. So having said this in her preface to the Institution, she immediately adds that the subject matter of metaphysics is obscure. And she concludes that metaphysics really consists only in what is obvious to anyone properly using their cognitive faculties. Something like a derivation of the laws of mechanics from metaphysical first principles seemingly would not be pre-philosophically obvious in this way. So I assume she would categorize it, like much that purports to be metaphysics, as lying beyond the bounds of what human beings can ever know. So in Wolff's terms, she adopts a fair bit of general ontology, but the prospects for substantive special metaphysics, specifically rational cosmology and rational psychology, are quite dim in du Châtelet's system. It's a bit better for rational theology because she seems to accept the cosmological argument, though not so much, say, the ontological argument, as far as I can tell. But this is a pretty limited picture of metaphysics as a science. So in conclusion then, I've argued that du Châtelet's principle of sufficient reason is straightforwardly different from Wolff's in a couple of respects. And even so, it might be possible to disagree with Wolff on some of these particulars of the PSR while accepting his demanding conception of science just on different grounds. But I've therefore tried to suggest at the end, again in a very promissory way, that du Châtelet doesn't really do this. Her conceptions of rational science, of explanation, and of understanding also seem different from Wolff's. And it seems like this shift in understanding, her shift in understanding the principle of sufficient reason removes a major motivation for adopting exactly this sort of Wolffian scientific paradigm and allows her to pursue, or helps her to pursue, a quite different approach to principles of scientific reasoning, even if the details of how and why she does so are beyond the scope of this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. So we'll take questions now. In order to preserve time, I'll start with both questions from the chat, but please raise your hands or leave a line in the chat if you have questions. Bill, I think you had a question for Clara.
Yeah, just a quick question. I just wondered, on de Châtelet's view, do any beings have necessary actuality? So a rock and a triangle have an essence and a being, whether they actually exist or not. But do any beings actually exist necessarily?
Yeah, so I think, and in
Are
principle,
all actual beings contingent, I guess?
okay. Yeah, so I'd say when it comes to what I was talking about, so the metaphysics of how we conceive of the natural world, I'd say yes, because necessity is really something that pertains to the non-contradiction of essential determinations, i.e. possibility. And it's du Châtelet goes on in chapter 3 to explain on this basis why essences are eternal and immutable and so on. So this basically has the consequence that beings are also eternal because their essences are eternal, and the necessity of their actuality is as such not given, but as soon as they are actual, they necessarily have a sufficient reason. And then when it comes to the other aspects of metaphysics in terms of her treatment of God and all these things, it might be a bit different. So you could, like, there's some form of argument that is based on the PSR for a necessarily wise and you know, for God basically. So there it might be different, but other
Yeah, I can see how a triangle might have a necessary property, like having three sides or something, whether it actually exists or not. But I wonder, yeah, I wondered if any actual being had actuality by necessity. But
yeah, I mean,
thank you for a very, very fascinating talk.
So I think like an actual being is also always possible, right? So every actual being also has these necessary determinations. So if we break a rock down to its essential determinations, then these essential determinations of this rock are necessary, and they're necessarily eternal and immutable. And the actuality of the rock, i.e. it being actual, it being gray and warm and all this is not eternal, and it's also not necessary as such. It's only necessary, it has a sufficient reason.
That's just fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both. Alberto has a question for Annelies.
Hi, Annelies. You know, in your presentation, you were talking about some epistemic impotence and constitutive imperfection and so on. Well, due to the human condition and human knowledge. And then at the end, when you came back after the post, you conclude basically that for Châtelet, we can achieve certainty. So my question is, first of all, what does it mean certainty for du Châtelet? I mean, considering this human imperfection, epistemic impotence, and so on. I mean, how does she understand it? And regarding to this, in du Châtelet, does God play any role or not in terms of explaining how human beings achieve that certainty?
Okay, thank you. For the first question, it was my point precisely. What kind of certainty could we grasp if we understand well what does it mean to be imperfect? And my answer was that this imperfection is not diminution, or it's not impotence, yes, but it is a way to understand what does it mean knowledge. If we understand knowledge not as not in regard to what could be the perfect knowledge, but only if we understand that knowledge is always a human knowledge. That was the starting point. And I mentioned that very briefly, but it seems to me that what is interesting in the Institution de Physique is precisely that she's not strongly interested by mathematical certainty or metaphysical certainty, but she tries to give a foundation to the physical certainty with this human condition. If this human condition is not a lamentation, but it is a very acute consciousness of what we are as subject of knowledge, knowing subject, we can understand that there is a perimeter where we don't need to go until the end of the reasons. On the contrary, we can understand that some phenomenon can explain other phenomena. And my point was precisely that in this perimeter, we can have this physical certainty. But for me, it's a discussion of du Châtelet with Leibniz, Wolff, and all what is developed at the same time at the Académie Royale des Sciences. That is what we do with this relationship between physics and metaphysics. And it seems to me that the answer is at the end of the avant-propos, when she said that we have two conceptions of metaphysics, one which is a traditional one, and the other one that we could try to touch more or less. And for me, all this explanation has to be put in relation with this proposal that she does with the split between two conceptions of metaphysics. So that's why there is, it seems to me, a reconfiguration of the conception of principle. And it's very interesting that she begins by chapter 1, principle, and chapter 2, God. Because, and it's my answer to your second question, because it seems to me that there is a function of God. And the beginning of the chapter 2 is how we can have a knowledge of a God. And it's not how we can prove the existence of God, but how we can have a knowledge of a God. And what does it mean? How could we understand at the same time that we have a knowledge of a God, which is not necessarily God? And the repetition during all the chapter 2 that we don't have the means to understand what God did. And this tension, this contradiction, permanent contradiction, seems to me a way to understand that she changed the conception of God. Okay, I don't know if I answer quite well.
I was wondering if she gives in some moments some conditions of certainty or yes, some conditions that it's important if we consider knowledge or like some highest degree of sorry, if we consider certainty of in some way some highest degree of knowledge, you know, something different, something is knowledge and certainty is in some way something highest of just knowledge or opinion or whatever. I was wondering if she gave some kind of you know, as I said, conditions or some steps that this is certainty and this is not certainty. This is just I mean, some approach or something like that.
That's the point in the chapter 4 when she said that we are so close to a certainty that we can consider it like a truth. Mm-hmm. That how could we do with the probability when we add many experiences which confirm the probability at an high level that we can change the status of this probability like almost a certainty. And it's precisely this almost which is interesting. What does it mean? And it seems to me that it means that we have to live with a new conception of knowledge, which is not how could we deal with a perfect model of knowledge, which is inherited from our conception of perfection, which is grounded on God. But we don't have access to that. So what we do with this access prohibited. But we have to understand that the knowledge as in his own conception, precarity, instability, almostity, if I can say. That is, yes. That it's my proposal. So you can you can discuss.
Thank you,
Thank you.
I will actually stay with you because you had questions for Clara and Aaron.
Yes, thank you. And yes, thanks a lot for your talks. It was very interesting. And I have one question for both of you concerning the same point because you have different answers. The first one is and another one for Clara. The first one is about the status of the principle. Clara, you say that the principles are metaphysical, and Aaron, you say that the principles are pre-philosophical. And what does it mean for you? Clara, do you maintain? And what does it mean? What does it mean metaphysical, when you say that they are metaphysical? And what does it mean pre-philosophical, Aaron, when you say that? It is my first question. And second one is just yes, a question. If you can help me, Clara, to understand a very mysterious and fascinating passage in the paragraph 25, because you say that to go to the possible to the actual, yes, if the possible became actual, it's by external cause. And I don't know if you remember the end of the paragraph 25, but at the, yes, not at the end exactly, mais voilà. I quote it in French because I don't have it, I don't have it in English. Sorry, Catherine, I have it, but not just in my mind there. So, car, je cite, I quote, le choix que Dieu a fait parmi tous les mondes possibles du monde que nous voyons est une preuve de sa liberté. And it's a very strong question, the freedom of God, okay? Car ayant donné l'actualité à une suite de choses qui ne contribuaient en rien par sa propre force à son existence, il n'y a point de raison qui pût empêcher de donner l'existence aux autres suites possibles qui étaient toutes dans le même cas quant à la possibilité. Et c'est là que ça m'intéresse. This point that I am interested by your reflection, consideration. Il a donc choisi la suite des choses qui composent cet univers pour la rendre actuelle parce qu'elle lui plaisait le plus. How do you understand this point? This conception of this? Yes. Is it okay? Did you understand my questions? Yes. Okay. Thanks.
So yeah, I'm going to answer maybe your first question first. So I just call it metaphysical principles because of the reference in the preface where she says, I'll explain to you in my first chapters, the metaphysical opinions of Leibniz, which I have drawn from Wolff and so on. And and then she goes on to say that she presents the metaphysical sort of foundation. And then the first chapter is the principles of knowledge. So that is the one thing why I think these principles are metaphysical principles, and then or belong to metaphysics. And then there's also, she says that to metaphysics belongs that what everybody who makes good use of their faculties can know, and then this what on the other side, this what we'll never know. And she says that everybody knows the principles without even reflecting on them. So this seems to be the same characteristica, that they are somehow so intrinsic to the faculty of the mind that they constitute our understanding of the world and of beings. So this is sort of in line with this definition she gives of metaphysical, and these are basically my main.
Does it mean that metaphysical significates innate? Yeah.
No, no, I wouldn't say that, because she also says that no being can exist that has not essential determinations which are non-contradicting. And these beings, they are specifically also beings like, for example, a rock. And I wouldn't say a rock in its actual existence or something is innate. So this is also referenced to an actual material world. So the metaphysical principles, I think, are principles of the mind and of what the natural world is. So I wouldn't equate metaphysical with innate in this sense. So Aaron, I'm going to let you answer your part of the first question, and then I'm going to come back to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Yeah, I probably should have been better about distinguishing different senses of the word metaphysical, because I was using it some of the time in a more kind of, as more of a transhistorical category to mean like not propositional or out there in the world in some stronger sense. But then in that last part of the paper, I was moving towards a more like disciplinary sense of metaphysical, like what is in the discipline of metaphysics, where it's closer to an actor's category for someone like Châtelet. And I was talking more about how she understands what's in the discipline of metaphysics. I think to that extent, on that question, I might agree to some extent with Clara, actually, because in this specific instance, I was just describing what she says about what falls under metaphysics as a discipline or an area of study. And she doesn't use the term pre-philosophical, obviously, that's my own interpretation, but she says this thing about, yeah, it being only properly what's obvious to anyone who's using their cognitive faculties adequately, which seems like quite broad. So to extend well beyond what we might recognize as a kind of academic reflexive discipline of metaphysics. And it suggests that these principles of knowledge are already in use in ordinary reasoning and the empirical sciences, in practical contexts, like I was mentioning earlier, practical reasoning, and not just kind of practical philosophical reasoning. So in that sense, yeah, there's no opposition between the pre-philosophical and the metaphysical in that disciplinary sense. Exactly how it stands with that, the pre-philosophical and metaphysical as non-epistemological, I guess, is a different kind of issue. But is that helpful? Helpful clarification? I don't know.
But the notion of discipline is not very established at this time. So there is no a clear conception of this is a discipline which is called metaphysics. So
Sure, but there are sort of exemplars like Wolf.
Yeah.
You knew Wolf fairly well
Yes.
at this stage. So I think when she's saying metaphysics is a science, but insofar as it's a science, it only consists of these things that everyone knows, given these very basic use of these faculties, and not this kind of expert learning. When she would know very well that for Wolf, science is this highly complex learned edifice where you have to start by learning the foundational stuff, and then you work your way down through the order of justification, basically, to really understand morality. For instance, you have to understand special metaphysics. To understand special metaphysics, you have to understand general metaphysics or ontology. To understand that, you need logic and so on. So it's of course, yeah, there are maybe a lot of questions you could ask about what exactly a discipline or a science is, but I think this indicates a difference from him. He seems to instantiate one approach, and she a different one, even if, yeah, exactly what that difference amounts to, one could quibble about. Is that?
And do you understand the distinction of two metaphysics at the end of the avant-propos of the foreword, as a distinction between metaphysics special metaphysics and general metaphysics in Wolf?
I don't know. I mean, that would be interesting. I'm not sure if she explicitly is saying that. It seems like what in practice she's doing is operating, on that distinction. But yeah, I would remain neutral on that, I guess. I'm not sure. So it's a good question.
I'll have to
Okay.
hurry you guys along.
Yeah.
I think.
Sorry.
So I think just to answer very briefly the second question, I think there are two things to say about this. So the first thing is, yes, she says that beings become actual on the choice because God wants this. And then she also says that the sufficient reason that God wanted this is not sufficient for a scientific explanation. And then she also says that attributes and modes have to have a sufficient reason. She says about the attributes that they have to have their sufficient reason in essences, and modes have their sufficient reason in other external beings or in modes before that. And then, so there's a very clear point that we have, from a scientific point of view, have to be able to understand sufficient reasons, and otherwise it's not a sufficient reason. And also that beings have a sufficient reason, which is somehow naturally explicable, and it's not just by the virtue of God. And then she also says that it's kind of also on the virtue of God. And then there's the question, is there conflict? And if so, why does she say this thing about God? I think there are possible ways you could go with the second thing, because there are many times when she says in letters, this person could be burned for what they said. And she was very aware that certain things about God must not be said without putting her life into danger. And I think this is one way. And then you could also say it's not really a contradiction. Like the actuality can be because it's God's choice. And this choice of God is also a naturally explicable sufficient reason. And it's important for science to put your finger on that, because if not, you could say with anything, oh, this is the sufficient reason, and it's just because God wanted it. But she makes really clear that this is not the case for her science.
But my question was very precisely about God choose because this possible. I don't know how we say in English, but lui plaît le plus. How do you understand that he prefers? But
Yeah.
it's not only a choice. It's a play is a kind of seduction. It's a kind of it's a sensitive choice, something like that. And for me, if you begin to check this this kind of explanation of description of choice, you will see it many times in the beginning of the institution. So my question is, what does it mean? Is it only to say that we have to close the metaphysics, so we have to understand sensitively the divine choice? So it's just a pedagogical explanation. I'm not sure that it's enough. Or is it a way to discuss what does it mean exactly? Choose for God. Because at the same time, she said that we don't know. We don't have the God point of view. We are not in this situation. So I am a bit puzzled by this expression. I don't exactly know how understand it, precisely in this context of the actualization of the possible. Yes, it was just a question like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're different. Yeah, she says that we don't know, and then she also says that in like the freedom essay, for example, that that the choice is based on an understanding, like a perfect understanding. So I think there are some suggestions there that this Gefallen, is based on some form of absolute reason. But yeah, I think you can also find these points where she says we don't know. Yeah.
All right. So now I'll take first a question from Monica and then one from Arains, I hope. So Monica first.
Okay, so I'll have to choose out of those 3 questions. I choose the question for Aaron because this is something that I'm particularly interested in. I really liked how you started talking about the PSR and how you wanted to put the PSR as more like I don't remember the phrasing on the first slide, but it was something that had to do PSR might be a family of principles, and they might be different principles based on the domain to which they might apply. And I got excited because I thought you're going to talk more about those domains. It's not just like the possible versus the, the actual, or like the non-contradiction, and just like the metaphysical and the physical. But I thought there might be a role for PSR even within domains of, say, the physical world. So you might think that PSR might be a good methodological principle, right, to help you within various enterprises that you have within the physics. So I want to ask you whether that part of the science that remained undeveloped in the talk, whether you have something to add, Aaron, because I want to see what you're thinking.
Well, I'm not sure I have a satisfying answer to that. Because I guess I would say that I don't think she takes any part of physics to not fall under the domain or scope of the PSR. It's a different question whether in actual fact, is it more useful in some areas rather than others? That may well be true. Like, are there certain kinds of problems that it's best at solving? I think, some interesting work remains to be done on some of the things she says about what we might consider like final causal cases, or at least cases that are less straightforwardly efficient causal. in examples like optics and things like this. Maybe that's a case where it's, from a contemporary perspective, especially well placed to deal with these problems. I mean, she does, yeah, she invokes it, as I mentioned, in these specific contexts fairly regularly throughout the physical portions of the institution. But yeah, I don't know if I can discern a single like pattern to that would suggest that there's a privileged domain. If
Well, you got me thinking about the fact that essentially what you might have are different reasons depending on the different domains that you are operating with. So whether, you know, the general formulation of PSR might remain the same, then the reasons that you're going to choose are going to be different depending on, you know, more specific context. That, yeah, I had got that idea from your talk.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, this, you know, this stage in this talk, I'm just trying to talk at this very general level because it's a comparison with Wolf. But yeah, I do think there's a kind of pattern of inference that you see in the physical parts of the institution. That is, it's a kind of subsumption under the PSR, I guess you could put it, where like you take some empirical principle and then you plug in the PSR and you derive some empirical results from that, I guess. I don't have an example ready to hand, but I've written on it a little bit in the past. So this is, yeah, this is like a pattern that she uses to kind of apply the PSR to matter or to force or to these, what we might call natural kinds or something like this. But yeah, that's I would consider that as a much sort of narrower scope than the really broad sort of basic questions that I was trying to deal with here, and probably harder, honestly, the specific level, which is part of why I didn't try to get into it. I would need more, you know, probably more knowledge of the physics and the historical context. So others can can contribute to this. This maybe better than myself. I don't know, but yeah, it's a great question. A series of questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you both. And now the last question for tonight from Ains.
Hi, I have a question for Émilie. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about where, where the word compelled to assent came from in Du Châtelet. I noticed that you quoted this passage in which she says that, and I was just wondering if you have any idea of, you know, whether she got that from Locke or from somebody else. That's it. Thank you.
I am not sure to have understood, Arendt, your question, but it was about knowledge of one God, or I
compelled assent, when she says, you know, until something is certain enough that it compels us to assent. Not sure if I can give a quotation at the moment.
It's a quotation of the paragraph 25 I quote just before, or it's another one?
I'm not sure. But I could email you and we can move on to a different question.
Okay.
If you like.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. No, it's okay.
I think this is actually will have to be it because it is exactly 3 o'clock here. So we will have to end. Thanks to all the presenters for a great panel. I'll give you a round of applause here, and I hope everyone is doing that at home as well. And yes, see you next week when we will actually have arranged again with a panel on Isaac Newton with Kirsten Walsh. So see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.